In John chapter 17, Jesus prayed for unity. And he said, beginning at verse 20, I do not pray for these alone, that's his immediate disciples, but also for those who believe in me through their word. That's me and you. I believe in the Lord through the word of the apostles, and so do you. So he's praying for us. And here's what he said, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. Jesus here prayed for unity, and our goal should be to strive for unity. If that's what Jesus prayed for, that's what I want. That's what you should want. In fact, we read among the things that God hates, the one that sows discord. God hates division. And so I want to hate division as well, because God hates division. And thus, because those principles are true, fellowship is a vitally important issue. Fellowship is a vitally important issue because Jesus prayed for unity. Now let's talk about the importance of fellowship. The importance of fellowship is seen in that in 3 John, some were condemned, or one was condemned, because he refused to fellowship those he should. You remember Diotrephes, who loved to have the preeminence, was putting some out of the church. And he was condemned for that. In other words, he was supposed to accept some, and he refused to accept them. Then on the other hand, 2 John verses 9 through 11 condemned those who were extending fellowship to those to whom they should not extend fellowship. Those who are not abiding in the doctrine of Christ. Those who are not bringing this doctrine, verse 10. They will have no part with them, verse 11. So if I learned something from those two books, those two little short epistles, that we are wrong if we refuse fellowship to those we should, and we're wrong to extend fellowship to those that we should not. That tells me something of the importance of fellowship. So let's raise the question, just what is fellowship? To some people, fellowship is a bunch of fun and food and frolic. And so some churches will have, as we will talk about this evening, a fellowship hall. They have where they worship, the auditorium where they worship, but they have a fellowship hall. That's where they eat, and that's where they have fun and games. To them, fellowship is having fun or eating food. What is fellowship? What is that all about? Well, let's let the Bible define that for us. So let's turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul is writing about the demands of the ministry. It ties well with chapter 5, chapter 4, as he also talks about this ministry. The demands of this ministry means we should walk worthy. That is, we should walk worthy, verses 1 to 13. But beginning here in our text, the point is that the demands of the ministry, that is our service to God, demands that we live separate from the world. And so here's what he says. Do not be unequally yoked together with the unbelievers. This is not talking about marriage, as some have thought, but it's talking about taking on a burden, like yoking oxen together and pulling together in the same load. So don't be unequally yoked together. The idea of being yoked means there's a common work. You take this oxen and you put it with that oxen, and now they're pulling together. They're pulling the same load. They have a common work. All right? Let's go further. He said, for what fellowship? Now, that's not the ordinary word for fellowship in the original. In fact, this word is only found one time. And what that word simply means is sharing in action. It means you've joined together, or partnership. The English Standard, if you're reading that, or New American Standard 95, it will say the word partnership. So what partnership, or that is what together does righteousness have with lawlessness? So here is a common work, sharing in action, partnership. And then he says, what communion has light with darkness? Now what's interesting is that is our word koinonia. You say, I don't recognize the word koinonia. Most of the time when we find the word fellowship, it comes from this word koinonia. That is a word that's translated communion in some places. It's translated distribution in another. It has to do with sharing in common. It has to do with fellowship, translated fellowship in many places, and this common work. We'll come back to that in a moment. But notice the words that he's using describing what he calls koinonia here, fellowship. All right, he goes further and says, what accord? These are all the same question. What accord? That's harmony of thought. When we are in one accord, there is harmony of thought. Well, let's go further. Another way of wording that same question he's been asking since the beginning of verse 14, what part has a believer with an unbeliever? A part together with others. You are participating with others. And then he goes further and says, and what agreement has the temple of God with idols? Here is a union of purpose. Now what we're doing is letting the context define how koinonia is used, how the English word fellowship is used in its context. What is it referring to? It refers to an agreement in principle that leads to joint action, our common action in spiritual work. So when we agree together in principle and we join together in the same action and in the same work, we are having fellowship. We're doing that this morning. When we all contribute together in the same work, then we have fellowship. In fact, as we support preachers of the gospel, that was called fellowship in Philippians 4. When we take money out of the treasury and help those who are in need, we're having fellowship with them. 2 Corinthians 8, koinonia again is used. So what is fellowship? It's an agreement in principle leading to joint or common action. So this morning I want to talk about fellowship in the truth. What does the Bible say about fellowship in the truth? What relationship does fellowship have with truth? Or is there a relationship? Is fellowship one question and truth another? Are they related at all? Or does fellowship and truth have a relationship one to the other? Let's begin with this concept. Let's understand that one idea of fellowship, one common idea, but an erroneous concept is what we call unity and doctrinal diversity. Unity and doctrinal diversity. This idea was advanced back in the unity meetings of the 1930s. If you know your history of the church, you remember the Merch-Whitty movement back in the 1930s. This was an effort, as we've been talking on Sunday nights about church history a little bit, that back when the instrumental music controversy came into play, and the Missionary Society came into play, a few years later, some were making an effort for all the churches that disagreed on those issues to be united, even though they had doctrinal differences. Well, let's fast forward to the 1960s and 1970s. There was the New Unity Grace Fellowship movement. You may recognize names like Carl Ketcherside, Leroy Garrett, and later Edward Fudge. Led in that movement, did a great deal of damage with their efforts. The first church in history to split over those issues was just 25 miles from here, where my dad preached for 30 years. It was the first church in history to split over that issue, over the doctrine of unity and diversity. And so that had a great deal of impact, even in our local area. There was the promotion of broader fellowship back in the 1980s and 19 of the abuse of Romans 14. All of those were saying we can be united together even though we teach different doctrines. We can have unity even though we have doctrinal diversity. Now what I want to suggest to you, if that's the case, then the basis for fellowship is not truth. Our basis for fellowship is loving one another, but not based on truth at all. And if that be the case, then we can disregard truth. Now, there have been some that made part of the truth. Listen to this carefully and you'll understand what I'm saying a little bit later. There are some who've made part of the revelation of God a basis for unity without all of the revelation of God. That's this old doctrine gospel distinction. That we need to be united upon the core gospel, that is who Jesus is. But we can be divided over doctrine, what he says about the church, what he says about worship, and what he says about marriage, etc., and on down the line. But we have to be united on the core gospel. Now let's start with this. Let's talk about the basis for fellowship in truth. What is the basis? Well, truth is the basis for unity. Truth is the basis for unity. Let's go back to our text in John chapter 17. This is where Jesus prayed for unity. And he prayed that those who believe on me through their word may be one, that we all may be united. But I want you to notice 3 times in the context the appeal that is made to truth. That there is a reference in this prayer. John 17 is a prayer that Jesus is offering for his disciples, and 3 times he makes an appeal to truth. Look at verse 6. You might underline, if you haven't already done this from previous studies, mark at verse 6. I'm reading down at the end of verse 6. You gave them to me, and they have kept your word. These disciples have kept your word. Let's go on to verse 17. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. There's an emphasis to the word at verse 6. At verse 17, let's drop down to verse 20. I pray for those who believe on me through their word. 3 times in the context, there's an emphasis to truth and the word, the revelation of God. And in that context, Jesus prayed for unity. What do you conclude from that? The truth is the basis for unity. Let's go to another passage making the same point. You remember the church at Corinth was greatly divided. Paul said, I've heard this report that there is division among you, and I believe it, he said. But notice in chapter 1 and in verse 10, he writes to them making an appeal that they be joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. I would that you all speak the same thing. I would that you all speak the same thing, he said, being joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. Now, what does he mean, same mind and same judgment? Here again, get the picture now. Church is greatly divided over several issues, but I want you to all be saying the same thing. And when you do, you'll be of the same mind and same judgment. Well, let's look at the context of the book. That same word mind is used in chapter 2 and in verse 16 to have reference to the revelation of Christ. We have the mind of Christ, the revelation of Christ. That's the context beginning at verse 9 of chapter 2. So here is the revelation of Christ, that you be joined together in the same mind, the same standard, in other words, and in the same judgment. The word translated judgment is translated decided in Acts 20 and in verse 3, which simply has reference to a conclusion. What's his point? That you all speak the same things when you have the same standard and the same conclusion from the standard. In other words, if we're going to follow my think so and you're going to follow your think so, we have different standards. We cannot be united. But we can be united when we have the same standard and then we have the same conclusion from the standard. In other words, we can be united on what one must do to be saved if we follow the same standard. But if we have different conclusions, one said, I think from this I learned baptism is essential. Another said, oh no, that's not what I get. Faith alone saves. We can't be united. We can only be united when we have the same standard and the same conclusion from the standard. That's what 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10 is saying. And so truth is the basis for unity. Let's go further. Truth is the basis for fellowship. Now let's go to 1 John chapter 1. No passage talks more about fellowship or abiding in truth than does 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. So let's go to 1 John chapter 1. In 1 John chapter 1, beginning at verse 1 through verse 5, without reading in detail every verse, he talks about the revelation that has been delivered by faithful witnesses. Just get the gist. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard and seen with our eyes and looked upon concerning and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. Here is a message about Jesus the Christ, and we are witnesses of that. Now notice at verse 3, that which we have seen and heard we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us, and truly our fellowship is with the Father and with the Son Jesus Christ. And these things we write to you that your joy may be full. Verses 1 to 5 says the revelation has been delivered by faithful witnesses. Let's go further. Let's look at verse 6. That revelation is the basis for what truth is. Look at verse 6. Verse 6. If we say we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not the truth. Now then, verse 7. Verse 7 says that same revelation that was delivered by faithful witness is the basis for fellowship. If we walk in the light as He is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus Christ, His Son, cleanseth us from all sin. So what am I learning? That truth is the basis for fellowship. From 1 John chapter 1. But let's go to chapter 2 now. Let's get a little more evidence from chapter 2. The commandments of God are essential that we might have fellowship with God. Now I want to begin at verse 3, he said, Now by this we know that we have known Him if we keep His commandments. Notice the commandments are the revelation of God. Now I want you to drop down with me to verse 6. He who says, I abide in Him, ought himself to walk just as He walked. And I know there's some concepts between verse 3 and in verse 6, but verse 3 through verse 6 makes the point that we must follow the commandments in order to have fellowship with God. 1 John 2 and in verse 7 we see again, I write no new commandment unto you, but an old command that you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you heard from the beginning. In other words, the commandment of God is the word of God. Now we won't take the time to trace all of these passages, but scattered throughout 1 John, on into 2 John, there is the continual concept of abiding in truth, following truth, abiding in truth. What are we trying to establish? That truth is the basis for fellowship. Here's a third principle. We're still developing the basis. Truth is the basis for rejecting. In other words, I have no right to reject someone from fellowship arbitrarily. I don't want to have fellowship with you. On what basis? Well, I just don't want to have fellowship with you. But it must be based upon truth. How do I know? Let's go to Romans 16, 17, and 18. Mark those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine. It's contrary to the doctrine. That's why you reject them and have no fellowship. Because it's contrary to the doctrine. So the truth is the basis for rejecting. Do you remember in withdrawing from those who walk disorderly, it was because they did not follow the word that was received, verse 14. So again, truth is the basis for accepting. Truth is the basis for rejecting. But let's go a step further. Truth includes the whole revelation of God. Remember the doctrine, gospel doctrine distinction I mentioned a moment ago? Someone may say, well, yeah, we need to be united upon truth, but we need to be united on the core gospel. We don't need to be worried about doctrine. Truth includes the whole revelation of truth simply involves the whole revelation of God. Now, gospel and doctrine are one and the same. You say, how do you know that? I know that because that in Romans, when people became Christians, the text says they obeyed the gospel. Romans 10:16. But another text in the same book said they had obeyed the doctrine. Was that two different things they obeyed? Talk about them becoming Christians. They'd obeyed the gospel and they obeyed the doctrine. That's one and the same thing. Let's get a little more evidence. When they obeyed the gospel and the doctrine, they also obeyed the truth according to chapter 2 and verse 8. And they also were obedient to the faith, Romans 1, verse 5 and 16 and in verse 26. So obeying the truth, obeying the gospel, obeying the doctrine, obeying the faith, is all one and the same thing. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. And I want you to notice in 1 Timothy chapter 1 how these terms are used interchangeably. Notice in verse 10, this is talking about how the gospel has penalties against, lies against the fornicators, the sodomites, the kidnappers, the liars, the perjurers, if there be any other thing contrary to sound doctrine. See that word? According to the glorious gospel. What he called doctrine in one verse, he calls the gospel in the next verse. They are not distinct, they're one and the same. Now the concept of this gospel doctrine distinction says aliens are to be taught the gospel and you teach doctrine to Christians. That's not how it was done in the New Testament. The aliens were also taught doctrine. How do you know? You remember the charge made against the apostles in Acts chapter 5? You have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine. They were taking non-Christians and teaching them the doctrine of Christ. That was the same thing as teaching them the gospel. They taught the people. Acts 13, they believed the doctrine of the Lord. The teaching of the Lord. Your translation may say it's the same word for doctrine. Again, depending on your translation. The gospel was preached to the church. We are told by some, you don't preach the gospel to the church. You teach them doctrine. You don't preach the gospel. Well, Paul said he was ready to go to Rome and preach the gospel to you who are at Rome. Gospel and doctrine are one and the same. Do you remember in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7 that Paul preached unto them at that assembly of the saints? They came together on the first day of the week, and Paul preached unto them. He didn't just teach them doctrine, he preached unto them. Now, what I want to suggest to you, the basis of this is, the truth is the basis for unity, for fellowship, for rejecting, and truth includes the whole revelation. Unity and fellowship is dear and it's very precious. No one wants to see a church divide or brethren divide, but it should never be maintained at the expense of truth. It should never be maintained at the expense of truth. Now let's deal with some objections that some often raise. If that's true, that we have fellowship based upon truth, and that's the basis of fellowship, then what about this? What you then become is you are a legalist. Have you ever been charged with being a legalist? Well, you may not have heard it, but you have been charged with being a legalist. If you believe that you have to abide by truth in order to have fellowship with God, in order to have fellowship with others, the charge is you are a legalist. The charge is you're a legalist for making an appeal to the law of God. You don't make appeals to the law of God without being charged with being a legalist. What that would mean is, when someone says, well, you're just a legalist, what they're saying is that they are opposed to using truth as the standard for fellowship. Pray tell me what we use. If it's not truth, tell me what it is. You see, the Bible says we are under law. 1 John 3 and in verse 4, whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is a transgression of the law. We're under law. That was the point of that, by the way, in the context. Talking about children of God in the context. And why do we not continue to practice sin? Because we're under law. That's his point. Galatians 6 and 2, we so fulfill the law of Christ. Bear you one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. We're under law. James 1:25, we're to continue in the perfect law of liberty. If that's not true, then there is no such thing as sin. We have some brethren today telling us we're not under law. We're not under law today. Really? What that means then is we don't have sin today. Because where there is no law, Romans 4:15, there is no transgression. If there's no law, there can be no transgression, and sin is a transgression of the law. If we're not under law, there is no such thing as sin. So do what you wish, because there is no such thing as sin. Well, they're quick to say, I'm not saying we're not under any law. Well, that's what you just said. We are under law. We're under the law of Christ. Here's another objection. That, you know what? We cannot understand the Bible alike. We just can't understand the Bible alike. It's so difficult, and there's no way we can understand the Bible alike. And so how can we be united on truth? The charge really says truth is not clear. What people are saying when they say we can't understand the Bible alike is this is such a difficult book, and you read it and you get one thing and I read it and I get something else. We just can't understand it. And so it's been argued the Bible teaching, for example, on divorce and remarriage lacks clarity, we've been told. And so my question is, what about Matthew 19 lacks clarity? You look at the text, can you not understand it? What is it about Matthew 19:9 lacks clarity? And furthermore, where does that end? Could we go then to Mark 16:16? It lacks clarity. What about the teaching on the deity of Christ? Does it lack clarity? So we can't really understand that either? Where do we end with that? I've been asked this question: what makes your position the default position from which to judge all others as being wrong? What makes your position on the deity of Christ the default position? In other words, isn't there room for another position on the deity of Christ? What about your position on the existence of God? What makes your position the default position? Is there not room for more gods? So we can ask God about any kind of question. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 3. Let's understand, we can understand the revelation of God. Paul said, where I wrote it for in few words, whereby when you read you may understand. He said you can understand. That you can read it and you can understand it. Here's something else he said. Let's go 2 chapters later, chapter 5 and in verse 17. Not only can we, he said we must. Be not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. You can and you must understand. I want to suggest that we can understand it alike as well. Remember 1 Corinthians 1:10, of the same mind, the same standard, and the same judgment, the same decision, the same conclusion, as we've already explained earlier. Here's a third objection. That we must all agree on every point and interpretation of every passage. If what you're saying is true, then this is going to be difficult because we all have to be in agreement on every passage, on every interpretation of every passage. And I know that's not true, someone will say. Well, let's understand that Romans 14 does, and we all agree to this, that it does talk about unity in spite of differences. The question is, what kind of differences? Romans 14 talks about the eating of meats. That had to do with personal liberty, where God did not care one way or the other. God doesn't care if you eat meats or if you did not eat meat. You can say, I'm not going to eat meat. I have a problem with it. It's not a matter of dietary things. It had to do with whether or not you thought it connected with the Old Testament law. And coming out of Judaism or connected with paganism, one of those two concepts, that because it had been offered to an idol or maybe because it had been forbidden, I can't eat that. My conscience bothers me. Well, God said, okay, you don't have to eat that. And someone else said, I can. Well, go ahead. God doesn't care if you eat it or not. It had to do with personal liberties. So all are not going to be in agreement. Listen to this carefully. It is not a simple misunderstanding of a verse, but sin that separates you from God. Peruse through your New Testament, and when you get through, see if you can find anything other than sin that separates you from God. Let me give you an example. Let's go to Romans 10:4. Romans 10:4 said, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. And someone said, I know what that means, that Christ brought an end to the law of Moses. Well, he did, but that's not what that's talking about. Well, you might misunderstand that, or maybe I'm the one that misunderstood that. But holding to either one of those does not lead you to commit sin. You didn't understand the passage, or maybe I didn't understand that. Let's take another passage. For example, Galatians 5 talks about the principle, abstain from every appearance of evil. Some say, I know what that's talking about. If it even looks like it's bad, then you abstain from it. That's not what it's saying, but some think it is. I think they misunderstood the text. Now, what about that leads you to commit sin? It doesn't cause you to violate any principle of the law of God. You may misunderstand the text. It is not a simple misunderstanding, but it is sin that separates from God. There's always a growing process where I'm learning more of what this text means. I'm learning better how to apply this text. That does not negate the fact that principles of truth are the basis for fellowship. Now, I know the basis, and I've seen the objection. Let's make some application of this. Let's talk about some issues. We've been talking on Sunday nights about various things that divided the church since the 1800s. And so I'm going to quickly mention some of those because I want to get to another point. But here's some of the issues that took place. And the question of fellowship comes to play. For example, on instrumental music, church-sponsored institutions, church recreation. And now in the modern day, we're having some problems, as we did from the 60s and 70s, of neo-Calvinism. The neo-Calvinistic idea that says God imputes righteousness to us so that he doesn't see our sin, but he sees the righteousness of Christ. Some of our brethren are arguing that and teaching that. And maybe there's the issue of divorce and remarriage, as we've had for a number of years, or some arguing for multiple causes for divorce. There is the idea of broader fellowship. We can fellowship anybody and everybody. And now we have loose standards so that we tolerate worldliness and unscriptural marriages. That happens in a number of churches. Those are some of the issues. But now let's look at what the question needs to be on any issue. The question is this issue a matter of revelation or judgment? or personal liberty. In other words, this matter of instrumental music, is it a matter of revelation? Does it violate the revelation of God? Or is it a matter of like eating of meats where God doesn't care one way or the other? For example, some object to men wearing beards. They think it's wrong. You may not have heard that, but there are some who think so. That becomes a matter of judgment, whether you have a beard or not. Doesn't matter. God doesn't care one way or the other. You can't find anything in the revelation of God about that. But you can find something about Bible authority. All right, let's go further. Does this teaching or practice involve sin, or does it lead to sin? Someone said, I can't eat meats. Okay, just don't eat it. That is not going to lead you to commit sin. Someone said, I can eat meats. Okay, you go ahead. That's not going to lead you to sin. Someone says, I believe that you can divorce for any cause. That's going to lead to sin. There we got a problem. So I need to ask two questions. Is this a matter of the revelation of God? And does this teaching or practice involve or lead to sin? Now the consequence. If abiding in truth is not the basis for fellowship, then we're saying it doesn't matter what we believe. See, our denominational friends have said that for years. Now some of our brethren are arguing that if abiding in truth is not the basis for fellowship, then it's saying it doesn't matter what we believe. If fellowship with others is based upon the revelation of God, or if fellowship with others is based upon the revelation of God, and yet we can fellowship doctrinal error, then we're saying doctrine doesn't matter. And that's the consequence that some have bought into. Now finally, let's talk about some warnings. Perhaps this is the most helpful, will be the most helpful to any of us, to look at some warnings. And so let's look at some warnings carefully. Number one is we need to be aware of drifting among brethren. How so? The winds of change are blowing. They have been blowing for a number of years and they continue to blow. The winds of change are blowing. The departures from the Lord in the present day differ from the past in that now there are many different symptoms. We've been talking about history in Sunday evenings. And in some of those divisions back in the 1800s, back in the mid-1900s, where there would be one particular issue coming forth and you knew which church was going in which direction and this one was going in another. But now we're living in a time where there's differing in many different symptoms. For example, among non-institutional churches of Christ, we find a dose of softer preaching. What do we mean softer preaching? Listen to this very carefully. It is not what one says that makes his preaching soft. It's what he doesn't say. Listen to that again. Someone said, I listened to Brother so-and-so and I didn't detect any softness. It is not what he teaches that makes preaching soft. It's what he doesn't teach. So when you sit and listen to a preacher for a number of years, let's say you've been in a church for 10 years, and you say, what? Yeah, I've never heard anything about instrumental music. I've never heard anything about Bible authority. I've heard very little about first principles. I've heard nothing about the organization of the church. I've heard nothing about worldliness. I've heard nothing about dancing, nothing about drinking. I've heard nothing about divorce and remarriage. I've heard nothing about that. Heard a lot about godly living and honesty. Heard all of that kind of, but I've heard nothing about those issues. You might begin to think that's some soft preaching going on. There are places among non-institutional churches where they're loose on worldliness. You're not hearing anything about modesty. You don't hear anything about dancing. You don't hear anything about social drinking. You don't hear anything about filthy movies. Not only do you not hear anything about it, it's tolerated. Among non-institutional churches of Christ, you have the blurring of the lines of the individual and the church. Because we're not teaching on that, we're blurring the lines so that we're not going to see in the future the difference in the individual and the church. There's confusion of cordiality with excitement in spirituality. We think because people are cordial and they're excited and they're enthused, they must be spiritual. That's not the same. Among some non-institutional churches of Christ, we're having problems over divorce and remarriage. You can get a divorce and be in your third marriage and no question may be asked when you decide to place membership. That's happening. You don't have to drive 100 miles to find that going on. Right here in Middle Tennessee. There are those who cast doubts on Genesis' account. Genesis 1 is not literal. In fact, Genesis 1 through 12 is not history. The ages of Genesis 5 are all exaggerated. Those days may be millions of years. And that, furthermore, we have the claims that we're not under law. You'll hear preaching that says we're not under law, but when questioned, I'm not saying we're not under any law, but that's what they're preaching and that's what they're saying without clarification. It's a multifaceted apostasy. Now listen to me carefully as I suggest that the danger is the changes come gradual. What I'm about to suggest to you, many of you have heard this before and some of you have never heard it before at all. I want you to listen carefully about how gradually apostasy comes. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 2 and in verse 1. The text says, therefore we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things that we've heard. Give very careful attention to the revelation of God, the things you know to be true. Give very careful attention to that. Why? Lest we drift away, the New King James says. Drifting like on a boat on a river comes gradually and slowly. It doesn't happen quickly. The King James renders that, lest at any time we should let them slip. That suggests a slow, gradual moving from the principle. The footnote in the King James says, run out as a leaking vessel. If you have a container, consider this faucet connected to a large barrel of 55 gallons of liquid that it's precious, you want to keep, and it's only dripping every once in a while, you're probably not going to be alarmed because of the slow nature of what you're losing. But over time, you'll lose it all. That's the nature of apostasy. It comes gradual and slow. Let me illustrate my point, and I think you can clearly understand. Apostasy comes slowly, and I want to picture for you how easily that comes over a period of time. And so I recognize what I'm about to say is not in the revelation of God, but let's just assume for illustration that it is. Let's just assume in order to worship God, that God's book had said that we must have a black square in our presence as we worship God. Maybe that's supposed to remind us of the darkness of sin. Whatever. For whatever reason, we're supposed to have a black square in our assemblies as we worship God. Let's just assume that Bible had taught that. And so here your little child was born about the time that we remember it being black like that. But over a period of 5 years, the deacon that was supposed to be seeing to that had let the sun get to that and it began to fade. Now, if you came in one Sunday and it's black and opaque, and the next Sunday it looks like this, we'd probably split the church. That's dark gray. But it took 5 years. That baby's 5 years old now. 5 more years. Began to fade a little more, and they maybe rubbing it and cleaning it. It's beginning to fade out. Remember, it took 5 years to go from this to this. There's not a lot of difference there, but we're beginning to see some changes. Now that little baby's 10 years old. 5 more years, and 5 more years, and 5 more years. You see, that little baby that was born back there is now 25 years old and is married. Beginning to have children of their own. Their children don't ever remember seeing the black square anymore. We come on down in time, 5 more years and 5 more years and 5 more years. Now you see this little baby that was born back there, the last time it was black and opaque, is now a granddaddy now. And his children, and certainly his grandchildren, won't ever remember it being black and opaque. Because within 55 years, we've gone from a black square to a white square. It just took 55 years. Now, for some of you, 55 seems like a long time. There are several of you in here will tell me 55 is not very long. Not very long at all. We see now there's a new generation in charge, and deacons are seeing to this. And we go from another 5 years. And I don't know if you can see very closely, but the corners are beginning to wear over where they're beginning to polish it just a little bit. But it's still a square. Still a square. Technically, it's a square. And 5 more years, and 5 more years. You see, it's beginning to wear, but it took 5 years to go from that 65 to 70, and 5 more years, and 5 more years. And you see the point, within 110 years, we've gone from a black square to a white circle. It just took 110 years. Now, if we had the assembly one Sunday with a black square and the next Sunday we had a white circle, you would split the church wide open. Never could you introduce that. But gradually and slowly, we introduce things and let things slide and tolerate until we've gone from a black square to a white circle. And if we can do that with white squares and black circles and on down the line, what's going on with the teaching on authority, the teaching on the home, the teaching on marriage, our practice and our application? Here's the second thing. Warning to be heeded. Understand there can be false teachers, this, among us. I think there is a concept that says there are false teachers in the world. They're out there in denominationalism. You say, well, they're among churches of Christ. Oh, yeah, that's among those institutional. There's where the false teachers are. I want to tell you, among non-institutional churches of Christ, there are false teachers. Let me give you some evidence of that. Look at Acts 20 and verse 30. The Apostle Paul warned the elders of the church at Ephesus that from among your own selves will men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples. Is that among you? If it could happen among them, do you think it can happen among us today? It is happening among us. Peter would write 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1 that there would be false prophets among the people, even as there would be false teachers among us. If it's possible for one to pervert the Scriptures, it can happen among us. So don't just look in the denominational world among institutional folks. It can happen among non-institutional. Here's the concept. We find out this is supposed to be a sound church in the sense it's non-institutional. And so we go there, we send our children there, and we assume it's a church of Christ, it's non-institutional, he's got to be solid. Not so. He very well may be as loose as a goose and tolerate anything. And so we need to understand that there could be false teachers among us. Thirdly, warnings that must be heeded. Beware of drifting. Understand there could be false teachers. You want to be prepared. You want your children to be prepared. You make sure they know the text in the context. So let's get our Bibles out. If you don't have this marked, if you've been here for a while, you should have this marked. So this would be a good time to mark this and make this point in your margin of your text. I want you to see the progression of thought. 2 Peter chapter 3, 16 to 18. What I want you to see in verse 16, speaking of the writings of Paul, that there are some, notice verse 16, that he wrote some things that would be hard to be understood. But notice what he says. As also in all of his epistles, speaking in them things, of which some things are hard to understand, which those who are untaught and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they also do the rest of the Scriptures. There's three things I want you to see. Number one, verse 16. There are some people who twist and pervert the Scriptures to teach something it doesn't teach. If you hadn't written that down, then take note of this. You might want to make a marginal note. Verse 16, there are going to be people who take the Scriptures and they pervert it to teach error. Number two, look at verse 17. You therefore, beloved, since you know these things beforehand, beware lest you fall from your own steadfastness, being led away with the error of the wicked. What's point two? You are in danger of being misled. What was point one? Point one was verse 16. There will be those who pervert the Scriptures to teach things that are erroneous. Okay, so what? Big deal. Oh, here's the so what, verse 17. The so what is, you could be easily misled. Point 3, verse 18. But grow in the grace and in the knowledge of the Lord. You say, what's that about? Verse 16 again. What's going on in verse 16? They're taking the text out of its context. Perverting and twisting the Scriptures. And if you don't know the text in the context, verse 17, point 2 is, you could be misled. So what's the answer? Verse 18, grow in the grace and in the knowledge. Learn your text in its context. And that insulates you against apostasy. A well-informed church is insulated against apostasy. That's why we do textual studies. That's why we preach from the context often. is if we understand this is the flow of the text. When somebody takes that out of its context, you say, oh, that's not what that's saying. I know that, and you're not led away. So one of the warnings is know the text in its context, and finally, realize that compromise will not work. Realize that compromise will not work. When it comes to the matter of fellowship, compromise never has and never will work. Here is a common idea. Common idea is I can teach against a doctrine while fellowshipping those who practice or teach that. I'm going to identify with this church, and they're teaching some things that aren't true, and they're practicing some things that are not right. But I'm going to sit with them, and I'm going to worship with them, be a member with them, and I'll try to teach them out of that. I don't know of a case where that's ever happened. I'm going to show you a case or two where that failed. But let's start with 2 John 9. Is that going to work? Let's go to 2 John verses 9 through 11. 2 John verses 9 through 11. John says, whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God, but he who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. We must abide within the doctrine of Christ. If anyone comes to you and does not bring that doctrine, are you reading with me? Then fellowship him and teach him while you fellowship him. Is that what it said? No, that's not what it said. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house nor greet him. Why is that? For he who greets him shares in his evil deed. You're fellowshipping and having fellowship in the evil deed. I want to suggest that there are those who tried that and they failed. Let me give you an example. Remember our history, if you've been with us on Sunday night, about instrumental music. During that controversy among churches of Christ, this is when instrumental music was introduced in the 1800s among churches of Christ, J.W. McGarvey, who lived from 1829 to 1911, taught against the instrument. He said it was wrong, it's unscriptural, it's not authorized. But he fellowshipped those who used it. This is from J.P. Sewell. He said, Brother McGarvey said to me, Brother Sewell, I want to say something to you, if you'll accept it in the spirit in which I mean it. And I told him I would accept anything he said to me. And he said about these words, you are on the right road, and whatever you do, don't let anyone persuade you that you can successfully combat error by fellowshipping it and going along with it. I have tried. I believed at the start that it was the only way to do it. I have never held membership in a congregation that uses instrumental music. I have, however, accepted invitations to preach without distinction between churches that used it and churches that didn't. I've gone along with their papers and magazines and things of that sort. During all those years, I taught the truth as the New Testament teaches to every young preacher who passed through the College of the Bible, which later became University of Kentucky, by the way. And yet, he said, I do not know more than 6 of those who are preaching the truth today. He said, it won't work. He said, I tried it. Further testimonies from Henry Ficklin, who was a student of McGarvey, he said that someone said while he preached against the organ and went where it was used, his influence went with his fellowship instead of his teaching. And someone wrote to me, he said from Indiana, and said, do you remember when you were there, whether any of those students were influenced by McGarvey in his talk position on the organ? He was telling people the instrument is wrong, don't use it. But he was going and preaching in places where they did use it. He said, no, I can't remember a single one. Not a single one of them changed. It was because he didn't teach on it as consistently as he ought, and he didn't back it up with his presence. Here's the lesson to be learned. You can't combat error by fellowshipping it. Your influence will always go with your fellowship and never with your teaching. In other words, let's just suppose that some brother teaches error on premillennialism, and we have him come for a meeting, but we'll say we believe him to be wrong about that. Guess where our influence is going to go? With our fellowship and not with our teaching. And it won't work anymore with you as an individual than it will with elders making decisions of fellowshipping those principles of error. What have we seen this morning? Fellowship in the truth. What is that all about? Well, truth is the basis for fellowship. Truth is the basis for unity. Truth is the basis for rejecting. We looked at the objections. We see the application. And here are some warnings when it comes to fellowship, unity, and the truth. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come in believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism, that you might obtain the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and sing?